Good morning. Welcome to Governing Conversations. My name is David Morar, and I'm a fellow with the Digital Interest Lab. Co-created by the Digital Interest Lab at NYU, directed by Professor Ann Washington, and the Information Society Project at Yale Law School, directed by Professor Chinmay Arun, the Governing Conversation series aims to provide scholars in the field and interested audiences alike a time for genuine reflection and critical perspectives on the study of digital governance. The cybersecurity theme is co-sponsored by the FGV Center for Technology and Society and the CyberBricks Project, directed by Professor Luca Belli. Today is the final event of both theme and the event series. Today, we're talking interoperability. I will leave you in the hands of our very capable moderator, Professor Ian Brown, a visiting professor with FGV's Center for Technology and Society. Professor Brown?
Thanks, David, and hi, everyone. Hi to all our speakers and panelists. Thanks to our organizers. This is a topic that's close to my heart, and I think all of our speakers' hearts. It's something, it's been a topic of huge policy interest in the European Union for the last 2 years. Amandine and I have spent a lot of time talking to EU policymakers over provisions in the Digital Markets Act, which I'm sure Amandine will mention, mandating interoperability for the largest messaging clients. We also have with us Suki Galati, who is an Internet Policy Research Assistant at MIT's Internet Policy Research Institute and formerly at the Center for Technology. Sorry, I'm mixing up the acronyms here. Center for Democracy and Technology, and an engineer at Meta. So it's great. We've got two people who've been really deeply involved in the technology side of interoperability, Amandine and Suki, as well as the policy side. And we're also fortunate to have Mehtab Khan, who's a resident fellow at Yale's Information Society Project and director of the Wikipedia and Yale Project on Intermediaries and Information. I should mention Amandine is the COO and co-founder at Element, which she'll tell us more about, and also co-founder of the Matrix.org Foundation. The way we're going to structure today's discussion, I've asked each of our three panelists to give us up to a 10-minute introduction. If any of our other participants during each talk would like to ask any questions of clarification, please do put them in our Q&A tool, and I can put those to the panelists immediately after their talk. But otherwise, we'll leave longer questions and conversation for the second half of our hour today. So to maximize our time together, Suki, I'm going to come to you first. Tell us a bit about your interest in interoperability, why you think it's important.
Sounds great. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. As mentioned, my name is Suki Galati. I'm a researcher at MIT's Internet Policy Research Institute, where I research policy compliant software systems, and interoperability is a big part of that. Previously, I've done some work for the Center for Democracy and Technology, where I researched interoperability as it relates to the open internet. And before that, I spent about 5 years in industry as a software engineer and engineering manager at Meta, where I worked on news consumption and public safety, as well as data portability, the download your information product, things like that. So my experiences in industry really led me to become a strong advocate of interoperability and decentralization, which is why I sort of pivoted to focus on these types of policy issues full time. I think they can really be powerful avenues of user empowerment, which is why I thought it'd be good to kick off today at a bit of a higher level, just a few reasons why promoting interoperability is important to me and why I think it is in the public interest. So just to level set, because I know we have a ton of diverse people in the audience, is a definition of interoperability. It is a general design solution. It is not just for digital systems. It can be applied to physical systems, to railroad tracks that can connect with each other, interoperate, having light bulb threading that works with light bulbs from many different manufacturers is also an example of interoperability. But of course, today we'll talk about it as it applies to software systems and digital systems. So in that context, interoperability refers to the ability of two systems to exchange data interactively. Often we're actually talking about exchanging data real time, but sometimes there might be latency, as with like healthcare interoperability data exchange systems. So a canonical example of this is email. Someone with a Gmail account can email someone using Yahoo. They can both read it on their inboxes. That means that those two mail providers are interoperable. They can exchange interactively the email data thanks to a common and shared data protocol. So why should we care though? Why should we care if applications on the internet are interoperable? There's a lot of compelling arguments for it, but I will give us 3 to start talking about. The first is that I think it's really important to promote an open internet. So many of us care and believe in an internet that is promoting a global free flow of information where people aren't siloed and prevented from accessing different subcorners of the internet because of technical or otherwise barriers. And interoperable systems can be a really powerful tool in promoting that openness and guarding against fragmentation. It's not perfect, but it's already baked into internet architecture. So the fact that we can load most any web page from most any browser is thanks in part due to multi-stakeholder adoption and investment in open protocols like HTTP and HTML and TCP, which enable that interoperability. But what we're seeing now is a sort of new layer of the internet where the modern experience is governed not just by going from site to site, but by using these really feature-rich software applications like messaging applications and social media sites. And those are often operating in closed networks, which aren't interoperable with each other. And so interoperability introduced into the application layer and not just the architecture layer can be a really powerful tool in bringing back that sort of open spirit of the internet to the modern internet experience. Interoperability is also important because it can promote permissionless innovation. So to me, permissionless innovation is this concept that occurs when the default is to allow innovation and experimentation and others to sort of continue or build upon existing work. So when interoperability exists, the barrier is lowered for an independent developer or an organization to come in and build on top of the systems that already exist. So, cybersecurity tools are one example here is that, when you introduce interoperability towards that tooling, you allow more security researchers access to different types of patterns for identifying vulnerabilities, and therefore a lot of innovation and diverse perspectives on sort of pattern or vulnerability recognition there. Browsers are another historical example. So if the platform's native browser, like the Safari on iPhone, or has actually happened with PCs and Internet Explorer, have privileged access to the hardware, then you're reducing avenues for innovation for independent browser developers. Whereas when you ask those hardware manufacturers to enable interoperability with any browser developer, or at least a greater array of them, to the hardware, you're opening it up for permissionless innovation or a low barrier to innovation in what it means to have a browser and to surf the internet. There's also security and governance benefits that come from having a distributed ecosystem. So a lot of our messaging systems, as Amandine knows better than me, I'm sure, will be discussed, and social media systems have at this point, in my mind, risen to the level of critical communications infrastructure. They're not just fun diversions. But when those sites cannot interoperate, you have large swaths of people operating under central governance, which means that there is one decision maker governing their experience. But from an architecture perspective, it also means that you have a single node of failure. The outages that can occur, when a site like WhatsApp goes down, affect businesses, individuals. It's a real security vulnerability for billions of users, and interoperability does not immediately lend itself to a decentralized architecture. You need more than that, but it lends itself to it much better than systems that are not interoperable and are not federated. So those are just a few reasons I think interoperability is really important. Before I close off here, I want to also just talk about some opportunities we have to still figure out what the implementation looks like and areas of further exploration, because as I mentioned, we haven't quite nailed implementing interoperability among our messaging systems or social media sites. And so I think there's a lot of different opportunities we have as academics, technologists, policymakers, and just interested parties to influence the way that implementation looks. The first point I want to make there is that interoperability is necessary, but not sufficient to spur diverse and decentralized software ecosystems. There's more that we need beyond just the existence of an open protocol or an open API. So even really successful implementations of interoperability, like email, can still result in a few main providers or market concentration. That's not a failure of interoperability, but I do think it tells us that we need something more, whether it's cultural or legislative or economic incentives or just a commitment to it. We need to kind of have a crisp picture of why we're doing it, the benefits we hope to capture, and what environment we need beyond interoperability to ensure that the innovations for which we're opening up that protocol occur. Second is that my background before I became an engineer was in HCI, so this is really human-computer interaction, really close to my heart. But I think in addition to investing in technical protocols, we need to invest in really intuitive user experiences. Every time you make a system interoperable, it sort of adds another layer of who has access to your data, where is it going, and who can see the posts that you're generating in a world that social media sites are interoperable. We already have some difficulties doing that now. Consent dialogues are not, research shows, necessarily the best at getting meaningful consent. And so it only becomes more complicated in a world of interoperability to communicate that to users clearly, intuitively, and at the correct level of granularity. So a lot of interesting work here. I think I'll stop there. Those are the main high-level points I wanted to make, but my main takeaway is that I think interoperability has a lot of potential to increase options for users, and we really have an opportunity to promote it, but also ensure that it's implemented in a way that really is in the public interest. So I'm excited to be on this panel and continue this conversation.
Great, thanks, Suki. That was a really good tour of some of the issues. I think the HCI element, I absolutely agree, is something that's really important, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. I just mentioned it's something the UK's competition regulator has also paid a lot of attention to in regulating digital markets. Great, okay, so our second speaker, Amandine Lepap. One of many reasons I always like talking to Amandine on this subject is we sometimes heard in Europe, European policy discussions, interoperability might be a nice idea, but from a technical perspective, it's a pipe dream. Actually, Amandine, both with the Matrix Foundation, which she has in the background there, and her business element, has shown actually, no, this is something that's it's had a big impact already, really thriving on the business side as well as on the nonprofit side. And Element, Amandine, I'm sure will tell us, has all sorts of interesting customers that you might not perhaps have expected from these kind of products, and certainly not that you would expect if interoperability was impossible to do in a secure way. So Amandine, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, everything that Suki was mentioning really resonated there. And everything she said is basically why we have Matrix here and Element. So for context, Element is basically a communication application which gives back the sovereignty over your data to the users and people who are using it. You can see it as run your own WhatsApp or run your own Slack, but in a decentralized and interoperable and secure, because end-to-end encrypted manner. Element does all this because it's built on Matrix, and Matrix is an open standard for decentralized and secure communication. So we created it specifically to bring this interoperability we have with the email to chat. And it's both what Suki's mentioned in terms of I can choose who is hosting my conversation. And also, once I've chosen my provider, I can also choose which user experience and which application I use to access these data. From a user's perspective, it's basically a matter of retrieving the control over my communication, but it's also unlocking the innovation, opening the market to smaller companies, forcing basically the players to compete on the value they add rather than just the size of the network. Because let's face it, today, if you look at communication applications, they basically all do the same thing, and basically everyone is reinventing the wheel every time. So Matrix exists as a completely open platform with completely open source reference implementations of servers and SDKs, and Element is an open source application as well as the flagship app for Matrix that anyone can pick up and then start from to build their own value add application on top, because maybe you want to address a specific niche market, or maybe you want to just add a small bit of chat into something bigger that you have been doing. So it's really easing up this process for people and allowing the users who are using these final apps to be able to access anyone. I am a chat power user and I still want to talk to my grandmother who probably would benefit from the simplest app as possible. And I don't want to have to switch to something very basic every time I talk to her. I want all my conversations into one place. So we started Matrix 8 years ago now. In 2014, Elements was, so the first versions of Elements were as a glossy application on top of the technology were started in 2016. And basically the first customers we've seen knocking at our doors were governments. Because let's face it, who else in the world needs full control over their conversations? Public sector, government. And the first one were the French government, after Emmanuel Macron came to power and have been going around saying, I run the government using Telegram and WhatsApp. And then you had the Ministry of Digital coming to us say, we need a kind of self-sovereign, secure way of communicating to run the country. Looks like you guys with Matrix are the only ones doing that, the only ones providing a way for each ministry to have their own self-sovereign communication platform, which communicates with the other ministries that they can host either in a cloud, public or private, or on premise, and apply the level of security they want, but yet still be a network. And guess what? Next is coming Germany saying, oh, we want the same for our armed forces. And oh, look, France and Germany can now communicate in a self-sovereign and secure manner. So that was a bit unexpected on our side. We were thinking like, let's just provide it to enterprise as a SaaS platform. But actually, a lot of enterprises are still pretty comfortable handing over the entirety of their IP to, in an unencrypted manner, to a Slack or a Teams, and haven't yet realized how much of a risk it is for them. So, so basically, the same way we've seen government and universities actually as well, especially in Germany, started picking up email and then seeing email growing into the wider market. That's what's happening with Matrix, with public sector and education picking up the open standard, and now we're seeing it expand into more the private sector. So another thing that we've added to Matrix is when we started building it, we had already 15 years background in building messaging apps and had been playing with all the other existing open standards like SIP or XMPP, built our own proprietary stuff. And that's basically learning from all of this to try to provide something which was relevant to today's chat, like what is the minimum baseline of feature we should be providing, end-to-end encryption should be part of it, etc. And something we learned is also that we are not going to force everyone to throw away their existing implementation of chat to actually turn into Matrix. So what we need to do if we want to grow the open network and have as many users as possible into this open network is to build bridges. So that's also why Matrix is called Matrix. It's just matrixing together all the different applications out there. So if you are using Element, for example, you can talk to people using Slack or using Teams, Signal, Telegram, anything out there. And then the idea is that whilst new players are building natively on Matrix and growing the network, then the other players are being bridged into it, the network grows, and at some point, the bigger players are going to look a bit like dinosaurs if they're actually not talking Matrix. And that's when the Digital Markets Act actually came into play and has been a bit of a revolution for us, because it was the European Union saying, oh, we really need this interoperability and open up these big silos that the gatekeepers have created. And that was completely aligned with what we had been doing for the last, 7 years or 6 years when DMA started. So what the Digital Markets Act is saying is, hey, big players, if small players want to interoperate with you, you have no choice but actually allow it. And they have, we are now, so DMA has been adopted. Now we are entering into the implementation stage. And how is it possible that when the discussions were going, a lot of the arguments from the gatekeepers were, it's impossible to do it securely, etc. And we're like, guys, we have, I forgot to mention numbers, but Matrix is 60 million users, about 100,000 deployments, and we are not aware of all of them because sometimes people just deploy it into a closed bubble and don't report into the network, and we don't know they exist. So when the gatekeepers were saying it's impossible to implement interoperable secure communication, who were like, we've been doing it for 7 years. So of course it is possible. Let me tell you how we can do it. So the DMA went through, and then the next step is, okay, how do we get WhatsApp to actually open up to other players outside? There are two ways. Either they just open their APIs, and then all the players have to implement WhatsApp APIs to be able to talk to them. So that's what is basically the baseline, which is mandated by the DMA. Which also means that if Teams has to do it, Teams will have to do it. And as a smaller player, if I want to interoperate with everyone, I have to implement every single open APIs out there. The other problem with it is if you want to keep end-to-end encryption, you will have to implement it's going to be hard to have one single chat room which can talk in an encrypted manner with WhatsApp users and Teams users, knowing that Teams is not encrypted. So that's a bit tricky. That's basically what we're doing with Bridge. If you want to connect between as an element users to WhatsApp, it means you have the matrix encryption on one side, the WhatsApp encryption on the other, and in the middle, at some point, you'll have to decrypt both sides so that you can translate it and re-encrypt it to go on the other side. So in this case, it's not fully secure indeed, and that's also why one of the big pushback that the gatekeepers have been saying. So our argument is basically that the solution is that everyone is actually speaking the same encrypted language. Matrix is one option that we have been working on and trying to make it simple. It's also tough for us to come and say, of course, everyone should be talking Matrix. So we're here. You can use us if we want, but well, there is a lot of work in terms of convincing existing standards body like IETF, for example, to say, okay, you should, rather than reinvent an open standard, maybe you should just use Matrix. But basically, the idea is if you have an end-to-end encrypted open standard out there, WhatsApp, rather than just exposing their existing interfaces and APIs so that anyone can just do whatever with it, they could just expose, like, do the translation internally in a secure manner and expose Matrix compatible or open standard compatible APIs, so that then as a small player, I implement this open standard, and hey, magic, I can talk to WhatsApp, but also Teams who have done the same, and Slack who has done the same, and Signal who has done the same, etc., etc. So that's the kind of discussions that we've been having with with Europe and the various people working on the implementation. That's also the discussion we're currently having with the various gatekeepers, with more or less success, because more or less want to listen to us. But in terms of how can we implement interoperability in a secure manner, well, it's just a matter of everyone agreeing on on one single language, which is end-to-end encrypted. Then, of course, comes the whole question of, but if I'm interoperating with if I'm talking to someone who happens to be on WhatsApp or on Matrix, it means that some of my data is going to Facebook. Do I want it or not? And we will hit this user experience, which is going to be an interesting challenge of making sure that people are aware of what's happening, giving them the opportunity to push back. And I think the implementation of GDPR is definitely not a good example, because obviously websites and companies are always implementing it in a way so that people don't read, just like push back, say, oh, yes, 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 just I don't want to see this pop up anymore. And it will be really interesting to try to force the players and the providers to actually provide it in a nice way so that the users can actually make a advised choice, a choice that they what's the word? Basically, a choice that they understand what they're doing, understand where is their data going and which data is going. Because if you're talking to someone and the only data is going over is just the chat you're having, you may be okay with that. Like, I'd rather talk in an unencrypted manner to my grandmother who is using her app, which may not be unencrypted, rather than force her into my app or have to use her app because the two apps are not compatible or interoperable. It's basically a choice that the user have to make, knowing all the consequences of this. And finally, the other challenge, which is going to be interesting for interoperability, is more a question around identity. How do you discover the users in the different applications, etc.? And that's basically decentralized identity, which is a problem which hasn't been solved yet. But we have enough people involved in this who have been working in this. We have enough brain power that we could solve it. It's just a matter of getting to it and agreeing on, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? What is the best interest for the users, etc. So I think, yes, that's basically a bit of a summary of how can we, from my point of perspective, and based on our experience in developing and deploying interoperable secure communications, this is how we see interoperability can be implemented. There definitely are challenges, but it's also challenges which we strongly believe can be solved. And I'm definitely with Suki on the angle of we need to make sure that it's good for the users, and we need to make sure that we prevent the providers to get it in a cheeky manner and trying to provide interfaces which confuse the user and force them into a bad choice.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's that's about everything.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amandine. Thanks, Daniel, by the way, for your question, which we'll come back to after all three of our speakers have concluded. Everyone else, do feel free to put in questions for the discussion. We'll go now to Mehtab Khan, and Mehtab is going to talk about interoperability and data governance.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you to the speakers. I will speak a little bit about some of the governing structures around what we've talked about in terms of the technical and user-centric approaches that have been developed to foster interoperability. So there are two aspects to governing knowledge and data that I will talk about. One is copyright and copyright adjacent rules, and the other is privacy. So in terms of copyright, there's a whole history of rules and advocacy around allowing and empowering users to make use of their devices and the kinds of knowledge and information that they lawfully get access to on various devices. So for example, ebook readers. These ebooks are usually loaned to the user through a license. Well, leased to a user, and they're not actually bought by the user, so they don't own that particular copy of the ebook. So this is important because traditional copyright rules allow the purchaser to then make use of the copy of the book as they please. They can distribute it, they can sell it, they can have a public viewing of it. But when it's an ebook and it's used and it's accessed only through a digital device, that prevents the user from making uses that they would have done for like a physical copy. And I think we also just talked about this earlier about how interoperability can be in the physical world too. It's about making interconnections. It's about being able to use devices and making linkages. So there's another rule, another law in operation here, which is the DMCA, and that prevents a user from circumventing technical laws. So for example, if you buy an ebook and you can only read it on a particular company's device, you can't then move it to another device. You can't download PDFs and share those PDFs. And it's actually illegal to circumvent these locks. They're called DRMs, digital right management tools. And there are only certain exceptions which allow you to circumvent those rules. So over time, over the last decade, these exceptions have increased in number through the advocacy and tireless work of people who are trying to foster interoperability. So some of these recent exemptions include the right to repair digital devices. So if you own a device, you can, like a vehicle or like a system in a home appliance, you can seek repair for it without the legal threat attached to it. You can use the ebook that you have for a very specific other purpose. People can now also modify voice assistant devices like Amazon Echo and Google Home. And there are also exceptions for security researchers to investigate flaws in their devices. But a few points that I want to make about the user-centric impact here is that first, these exceptions are very narrowly framed, and they also cut into what is the possibility of use and what a user could do if they didn't have these locks and these restrictions on how they could use something that they lawfully purchased. And that has an impact on interoperability because it limits the creative potential of what you could do with something that you lawfully bought. And copyright ties into that because the rules that exist in like the physical world with your physical copies of the works that you buy are different from the ones that you can apply or exercise on your digital copies. So this is something to note as we devise interoperability rules, as we devise interoperability architectures, the kinds of devices, the kinds of individualized and personalized devices that we're seeing come up, and how users are going to be able to experiment or tinkle or repair or do anything with these things that they purchase. Another long-term effect that could happen with these incremental changes and exceptions is that these incremental uses could become the norm. So anytime there is a situation where users advocate for a certain kind of use that would foster interoperability, they would have to ask for it, they would have to advocate and agitate for it. It would not be the norm. And restrictive terms would become the norm because it's companies who are designing and selling these devices who are able to determine what the terms of service are, how the law applies, and what users are able to do. So that's one aspect involving copyright and the DRM rules and how exceptions are being devised. The other aspect of interoperability and the kind of governance structure that we need to pay attention to is privacy. So as companies make their APIs and their data more available, as we devise ways for companies to share data with each other, we also want to pay more attention to how the companies themselves are collecting that data. Are they mining it from public websites? What are their practices? How are users being informed? And how does that feed into what they end up sharing through interoperability architectures? So for example, if there is sensitive data about users on a social media platform, how does that factor into something that's designed on that data? So for example, if there's a group of users who belong to a certain community, like a religious or whatever marginalized group, and a social media platform holds data about them and is able to draw conclusions about them, how does that feed into an application designed, like a surveillance application, for instance, that's designed on data that social media platform collected? How will that then be shared with other platforms? How will that determine how surveillance applications are used by other people? Who has access to it? What are the terms of it? So there needs to be a lot of attention paid to the practices that go into and the terms that go into defining how that data is collected and used by that specific company in the first place before we talk about interoperability. So we need to be asking companies questions about how they are using that data in the first place and having those terms clearly defined before they make it openly available for any third party to make use of. So copyright and privacy aspects, I think, are two important dimensions that need to be taken into consideration when we're designing interoperability policies, when we're looking at how users are going to be impacted, who is going to be impacted, how they can be empowered, and kind of look at the balance of how easy it is for one party to make access available and the other party to make certain uses of it. Is the balance still tilting too much in favor of companies, or are users getting some piece of that empowerment? So apart from these two aspects, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have on policy-related issues.
Wonderful, thanks, Mehtab. What I'll do is I'll go straight away to the first question that we've had in the Q&A. So this, I'm not sure which one of you would like to answer this, but feel free to jump in. Daniel Boffa asks, how do you approach the downstream challenges of interoperable systems, such as the need to curate redundant data? For example, managing multiple inputs for a data field that is contradictory. In healthcare, these decisions, rules engines, etc., could have significant implications. Suki, you're nodding your head. Would you like to take that one?
I have an answer. It's maybe an unsatisfying answer, but I do.
Great.
But yeah, my probably unsatisfying answer is that I think that this is like a domain specific design challenge, which just harkens back to the need of a real focus on user experiences and human computer interaction. So specifically in the context of healthcare, I think the reason that interoperability would be a benefit, even in this scenario, is you already have, redundant data coming in, and maybe you have patients giving conflicted answers. Maybe you have the inputs from different offices can still be redundant and contradictory. But if you just have one piece of software that's dominant, or an individual clinician making those decisions individually, then it's sort of unpredictable how that redundancy and contradiction is managed. But in a world of interoperability where people are complying to a different standard, this is something that you are complying with a common protocol. You could have a proliferation of clients that choose to handle that contradiction in data or that redundancy in different ways. And through that proliferation of clients that handle that redundancy in different ways, you would hope that you could choose the one that you think is handling in the way that is most conducive to making good decisions at your practice. And the reason I say it's domain specific is because maybe I'm wrong about this. Healthcare is not my domain of expertise, but I would imagine for an individual patient, it's not as much of a volume issue as potential contradictions. But one person's clinical history seems like not huge scale data sets. Whereas if you look at like social media, combining a bunch of different feeds, the question of redundant information can be way different. We can be looking at millions of pieces of content that could be redundant, at least topically, if not potentially even the same content parsed differently or packaged differently. So I think it is ultimately a domain specific challenge that in any domain has a lot of different answers, how you handle redundancy, contradiction, data at scale. And so the value of interoperability is that you have more choice in how a client is choosing to address that design challenge. And there's room for different clients to address it differently. Whereas if you have one sort of dominant market player or just a few dominant market players, you lose choice, and it's more about advocating that in that organization or corporation whose incentives may not be aligned with yours.
Great. Suki, I also wanted to ask you, I don't know how closely, I know you've published various things with CDT. How closely were you following the debates in the US Congress about potential statutory requirements for interoperability in bills? I'm thinking of the American Online Innovation and Choice Act, for example.
Yeah, I was following that to an extent. I don't have any sort of fun non-public information for you that I can share, but I do have opinions. Were you looking for sort of insights on the bill or the text of the bill, or?
Is this, so as Amandine mentioned, it's for messaging, this is now a league, this is, it's in a law that has passed, it's going to come into force next year. The largest gatekeeper platforms will be required to offer this. I guess I'm asking you a political intelligence question. Do you think this is going to happen in the US anytime soon? Or is it, obviously these are very big, powerful companies we're talking about. Do you think they'll manage to push back hard enough in Congress to stop that legislation for now?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't necessarily have the best answer for you. I think my answer is that your guess is as good as mine, but the optimistic answer is that there's certainly more political momentum around it than there has been in the past.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Amandine, I don't know if you can see the Q&A as well. I think this question is definitely for you, from Philippe Riedel. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Protocols are interoperable systems, least common denominator. As such, the bottlenecks for functionality, and there's the risk of innovation deadlock. How to best govern the protocols of interoperable systems, by whom and by what kinds of organizational designs?
So I can share how we've been doing it and what we've implemented for the Matrix Foundation, based on, again, what we've been saying working for other protocols. So it can be anything from the web, anything from IETF, W3C, but also XMPP and this sort of things. So the way we've done it is first present Matrix as a single spec. So that's very much a reaction to XMPP, for example, which allowed kind of modules that you could add, which meant that some applications were implementing one version of XMPP using certain modules, for example, for encryption, and then someone else would use a different module for encryption, which meant that interop would not work. So in our view, if you want an interoperable system, you need one single spec that everyone can refer to and which is backwards compatible. Then we were also, so we started this with the idea in mind that we needed to put out there a kind of de facto standard. So the foundation is not attached yet to any of the existing standards body. It's just an independent non-profit managed by 5 guardians, which are 5 directors. It's a UK, it's a limited company with charitable status, CIC. And 5 guardians, 5 directors responsible for making sure that the spec coming together is aligned with the mission of the foundation and what it's trying to do. And then we have another group of people, which is called the spec core team, which actually decides what goes into the spec. So we spend a lot of money and time in determining the governance for this foundation. And basically anyone can propose changes to the spec, and anyone can make a proposal, suggest a new feature, and submit it. And then it's a discussion with, first it's run past the community. People can iterate on it, ask questions, and get to the nitty-gritty of the details of how it can be implemented. When we do it as Elements, which hires actually the core team which created Matrix, and we are one of the biggest contributors to Matrix itself. And when we do it, I usually implement as we go the change that we are proposing, because we don't want, that's something we've learned from other standards body, where people spend a lot of time writing down big documents, and then comes the time of implementation 3 years later, and oh, maybe there was a gap here. So we are pushing it strongly into, you implement at the same time as you define, then you make sure that whatever you're proposing actually works and is fit for purpose. And then once you have this proposal, it goes into, you have a whole approval process with time for the community to comment and push back. And then the spec core team, which is 8 people, needs to approve it at 75%. And then this spec that could have been proposed by anyone is merged, this proposal is merged into the main specification, and anyone who is implementing Matrix and want to use it should implement this version, which has been defined, which means that, for example, lately we created location sharing. If you wanted to any application using Matrix and wanting to add location sharing, should implement it based on the spec, and magically it will just work with any other Matrix app which is doing application sharing. So we started up with something very simple, which was including what we believed was the baseline of chat. So group, one-to-one, end-to-end encryption, ability to manage calls, etc., file exchange, etc. And as time goes, and things like basically the baseline of what is considered as basic chat feature is going up, then the features are added to the spec, and the lowest common denominator just keeps increasing. The other thing is flexibility. Matrix is not just for chat; it's actually an ability to synchronize any type of data. We've done IoT, we've done VR on it, we've done so voice and video, etc., etc. So it's very flexible and expandable. You can put anything in it. And the other thing is the foundation being still independent means it's very quick. Like we've been starting to talk with IETF, and we know that in the second a standard body like IETF, for example, is the second Matrix is being handled over to a standard body like IETF, the speed of releasing new versions and changes is definitely going to change and slow down. So we would have to see how to manage that. Does it answer a bit the question?
I think so. That's great. Thank you. Mechab, I wonder if I could ask you a specific question as well. You talked particularly about copyright and DRM, which is something I've long found interesting and frustrating. Also, we've heard calls often in the past from traditional publishers that they would like to see more interoperable book readers, Kindle type software as a way for them to have a more level playing field with Amazon. Obviously, that's something where DRM would certainly potentially cause an issue. How far is this something that you or others have been writing about legally in terms of explaining to Congress and to law reformers what they would need to do to make this work in practice?
I think that that's a great question. I would qualify it by first asking who the publishers are. Are they small scale publishers who don't have as much reach and rely on digital platforms for their reach? Or are they large publishers who charge or who can afford to charge exorbitant amount to users and for platforms to access whatever they're publishing?
I think big publishers who are upset at the market power of Amazon.
Yeah, then I think that there's a whole dimension to how big publishers have also tried to shape copyright law in ways that is not always user-friendly and conducive to user rights or copyright, or actually just public interest. And so if it's large publishers, I think that in order to protect users, we'll need to pay attention to what those terms are, what publishers and platforms agree to, how that impacts public interest related exceptions like fair use, what would users be allowed to do after those terms and agreements, how would users access those books, how could users continue to exercise the rights that copyright law already gives them. So whatever terms platforms and publishers agree to, we would have to apply a very user protective lens to it.
Great, thank you. For everyone in the audience, we've still got time for one or two more questions if you want to put them in the Q&A, but let me ask another one to Suki, if I may. Suki, in the EU, we've got this legal requirement now on the messaging service side the European Parliament also wanted social media platforms to have an equivalent interoperability obligation, but that was something that the national governments pushed back really strongly against. Is social media an area where you think interoperability offers, useful possibilities, or do you think perhaps there might be a different balance of costs and benefits there to messaging?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is definitely a different balance of the costs and benefits. I still think it airs out on the side of interoperability is a good thing, but I think it's a much thornier question for a couple of reasons. The first reason being that we can't necessarily even agree on a definition of social media, right? So TikTok is sort of a great example of this, where you don't actually need to have a network in any capacity or a social graph to have a really engaging experience on that platform. Same with YouTube. And so would you classify those as social media or things that need to make their content interoperable? On one hand, maybe not by a strict definition, but on the other hand, if you really want that short form content to break up network effects on other platforms, then maybe you do. So I think that has to be resolved. And then the second big question with social media is, with messaging, it's a little bit more straightforward where the area for market differentiation exists within client and client-rich features, because the actual message itself is the part you would make interoperable. That's not as clear with social media, right? Where do you draw the line with feature sets? Maybe text posts are interoperable, but what about ephemerality? The unique aspect of Snapchat is the disappearing messages. What about the story format, which sort of began as a proprietary invention, but is now so ubiquitous that you might characterize it as an intrinsic feature of social media? So all of that is to say, and of course, there's also there's a bunch of research around navigating multiple social identities, right? Who you are on LinkedIn, you might never want that to be, even by mistake, interoperable with your Finsta. So I think that at the end of the day, it's a powerful tool to break up network effects, and it's not one that we should give up on. But there needs to be more research to ensure that the user experience that we make interoperable is one that users actually want to be interoperable, that would actually get benefit from being interoperable, and further so that we still do preserve room for innovation, and we don't sort of make static what social media is by rendering a set of things interoperable. So still an advocate, still a proponent, but I think more research to be done in that field.
Great, thanks. Okay, we've got two more great questions, and then I think we're going to have to close because we need to finish on time. So one more for Amandine. Is it more likely security vulnerabilities are more likely to happen on the platforms or on the bridge? Does interoperability tend to nudge companies to using higher levels of security, or does it more often force communication to fall back to lower levels because of the incompatibility of protocols?
Bridges are definitely not ideal because they are indeed a kind of single point of failure, which adds a risk. Basically, if they expand the risk surface. So yes, if we use bridges, then it's probably going to expand the risk, but then it's also, again, a choice from the user. Do I want the benefits of interoperability and the ability to choose who is hosting my data, and I choose to take the risk because my communication is more important than the risk itself, or not? And that's basically when talking to Signal, who is a strong opponent of interoperability, we're like, well, yeah, if your objective is to be as secure as possible, then stay in Signal and don't talk to anyone else. If your objective is to choose where your data is stored, have control over it, and use the user interface of your choice and have access to the biggest network as possible, then you may want to increase a bit the risk. However, if one day we eventually get to a point where all these applications are interoperable via an open standard, then we expect the standard to be strong. Then you could also have some providers which are less trustable than others. And the same way, when you create your email address, you may want to choose a provider that you know is like, if you go to ProtonMail, you should be pretty sure that it's going to be encrypted, it's going to be secure. That's their selling point, that's their whole marketing. And if you choose a random mail provider that no one has heard about, you don't know where it's hosted or whatever, you're taking a risk. And it will be a bit the same evaluation you have to make there.
Great, thanks, Amandine. That question was from Jason Morris. Philip, I apologize, I'm going to skip your second question because we've got one final question from David S. And David hasn't asked a question so far. And Mehtab, I think this is another good one related to DRM. I'm sure you're very familiar with all of the arguments about the extent to which DRM protections in law should be sort of explicitly, there should be explicit carve-outs, as there are, you've mentioned some of them, versus, you know, when is it better sometimes that people just attack DRM and say, damn the consequences, or, you know, there are certain exceptions for punishments for breaking DRM, you know, for scraping is an example that David gives, and that clearly has implications for interoperability as well as on the DRM side. This is something you might have, all of you, I'm sure, have come across Cory Doctorow's writing on adversarial interoperability. Give people the opportunity to break, you know, the gatekeepers' walls down. Don't force the gatekeepers to open up. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's like an understandable response to the environment that we've created that hinders interoperability. And you also have to look at how the people who gatekeep are at a much smaller scale than the users who are trying to break them open. So users are always going to be in the majority. They're the ones who are usually shut out from the processes and the you know, the structures that enable people like platforms and companies to institute those barriers in the first place. So I think that adversarially seeking data, or like seeking to break controls, seeking to modify protocols will always exist, because the norm on the other side is usually to be protective and to concentrate power in the hands of a few, and also to kind of gatekeep as the norm. So I think that this approach will always exist, no matter how many exceptions we develop.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. I'm going to hand back to David, who just wanted to close the seminar series. David, are you able to jump back in? Perfect.
Of course, perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Brown, and thank you again to our host and panelists. This was the final event in the Governing Conversation series, so I wanted to thank all of our co-sponsors, the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and Michael Kara-Nicholas for Platform Governance, American University's Internet Governance Lab and Institute on Disability and Public Policy, and Professor Derek Cogburn and Professor Filippo Trevisan for Access and Accessibility, and finally, of course, FGV's Center for Technology and Society and CyberBRICS Project, and Professor Luca Belli for Cybersecurity. Thank you to the series co-creators, Yale Law's Information Society Project, its past and present executive directors, Nicholas Guggenberger and Chinmay Arun, and Digital Interest Lab's director, Professor Ann Washington. Finally, thank you again to all of our moderator, panelists, and most importantly, thank you to you, our audience. The videos of all of our previous events, including this one, are all online on digitalinterest.org, and I invite you to go check them out.